you for joining us. I'm Wilson Stribling. Welcome to another edition of At Issue, where we discuss and debate the critical issues facing the state of Mississippi and how these issues impact you. At Issue tonight, the state of the state. Governor Phil Bryant presented his annual address to a joint session of the state legislature on Tuesday. Here are some of the highlights of his speech. The governor supports changing the way public education is funded in Mississippi. EdBuild, an education consulting group from New Jersey, is suggesting changes for lawmakers to consider. We'll have details on that in a moment. The governor also supports keeping BP oil spill settlement money to help Gulf Coast areas. The state will soon begin receiving hundreds of millions of dollars from that settlement. The governor is also asking lawmakers to fund a trooper school for the Mississippi Highway Patrol and to consider implementing a state lottery to bring in more revenue.
I also eagerly anticipate modernizing the formula we use to fund public education. Like many of you, I believe we should devote resources to education programs that have consistently achieved their stated goals and prioritize spending where the student gets the most good out of our investment. The priority should be in the classroom, not at central office. This is an idea that I hope is shared across the political aisle and by the educational lobbyists and education establishment. Our school children and their parents deserve nothing less. I will also ask you to create a new and separate savings account for this year, one that will house what remains of the initial payment from the BP economic damages settlement. That nearly $110 million should go into the Gulf Coast Restoration Reserve Fund. Now, when the time comes, thank you, Gulf Coast, when the time comes to assemble the budget for fiscal year 2019, I still believe the fund should go where the worst damage occurred, our Gulf Coast. However, I think it would be wise to reserve these funds until appropriate projects and potential leveraging of other funds can be thoroughly considered. We are in desperate need of a new trooper school. Currently, the Mississippi Highway Patrol stands at 161 troopers less than is statutorily allowed. Now, fortunately, this is not a dictatorial formula. However, the safety of the motoring public and the troopers serving today rests with your decision. And I ask you tonight to back the badge of our troopers and put more of them on the road. As I stated in my budget recommendation, I'm open to a general discussion regarding the implementation of a state lottery. As you know, voters cleared the legal pathway for a lottery in 1992 when they chose to remove the constitutional prohibition and allow this legislature to provide authorization and control. Arkansas, the state closest to us in population and demographics, received $80 million from its lottery last fiscal year. That kind of data demands attention. When we see traffic crowded on the Mississippi River Bridge taking revenue to our neighboring state, it may be time to face a new reality. We can no longer contain the people's desire for a lottery. We can only force them to travel.
The Democrats fired back after the governor's speech. Here is a portion of the Democratic response.
Democrats have good ideas about how we can generate more revenue and put our state back on sound financial footing. They include good-paying jobs. We support legislation to fix our roads and bridges and create 4,000 jobs in the process. Raising the minimum wage to at least $9 an hour, because no hard-working Mississippian should have to work a full-time job and still live in poverty. Equal pay for equal work. Nobody should make less simply because they are a woman. Availability of child care for working Mississippians so they can stay working. Making sure our mental health care system is adequately funded. The mentally ill of our state deserve to have the best care possible so that they can lead full, contributing lives.
Available basic health care, including mental health care for everyone, healthy people or working people. Workers' rights, including the right to come together and negotiate a fair wage and reasonable working hours. Unions built the American middle class, and they will rebuild it. transparency and accountability in government, responsible to the taxpayers of this state, no more secrecy in your government, full funding of your public schools. If Republicans believe like we do that Mississippi's kids can't wait, then we must make K through 12 funding a priority and not just a catchphrase.
Democrats understand that people are tired of partisan bickering and want their government to work for them. I hear it every day at home in my district, and I don't think that concern is unique to my part of the state. Mississippians see partisanship in Washington on display every time they turn on the news, and they think that's the way things work in Jackson, too. We are committed to working with our Republican colleagues to tackle these and other big issues, and we ask them to join us in showing Mississippians that we can do better than Washington. The problems we face weren't created overnight and are too big to be solved by one party or the other. After all, that's what our constituents sit here to do, solve problems and make our state and their hometowns a better place to live.
The other big event at the state capitol this week, the recommendations from EdBuild on funding public education. People packed the old Supreme Court chamber to hear EdBuild CEO Rebecca Sibilia deliver the company's report to a joint House and Senate meeting of Education and Appropriations Committee members. EdBuild is recommending a gradual phase-in over the next 5 to 8 years to increase the amount spent on each public school student to a range of $4,700 to $5,300. First, we hear from Sibilia as she explains the specific funding increases for low-income students, English as a second language learners, and special needs students, and then thoughts from lawmakers.
What we're saying is that the state should consider spending more money on an enrollment-based count than what it is currently funding for a general education student. We're asking that 20% in additional resources be provided to low-income students, about 20% for English language learners, more resources for students that have special needs, and more resources for all students in high school. That will be dependent on the actual base amount that the legislature decides to adopt.
We're very excited. It was a very thorough report, and at this point in time, I can tell you that Mississippi actually got its money's worth with EdBuild, but it's amazing how much research and how much effort has gone into this report.
It's a mixed bag of tricks. I heard some words like consolidation, administrative consolidation, but then I heard other things that concerned me greatly, which was cutting funding from the federal level and the state level and shifting it back to the local school districts and property taxes.
That's what they are, a recommendation. So, but what they presented to us was, I thought, very well done.
Low-income students, that's the ones I'm concerned about, and it looked like it could end up with some cuts there, but I'm not sure, so we're going to have to look at it a little bit closer.
Lawmakers are still awaiting more specific data on how these proposals would impact individual school districts. The state's current funding formula, the Mississippi Adequate Education Program, or MAEP, was put in place in 1997, but it has been fully funded only twice. Let's get straight to the point with views from both sides of the aisle. Brandon Jones is a Democrat. He's an attorney with the Beria Jones Law Firm and a former member of the Mississippi House. Lucian Smith is filling in for Austin Barber this week. He is a Republican and former chief of staff for Governor Bryant. He's currently with the law firm of Balch and Bingham. And we thank you both for joining us this evening.
Thanks,
Austin, good to have you back with us in Austin's place this evening. Let me start with you, Lucian, on the topic of EdBuild. We finally got this report from EdBuild. The lawmakers had been anticipating it before the session started. Did we really learn a whole lot after it was finally presented?
I mean, I think we learned that the formula that we've currently got needs a lot of changes, and I think that's a universal view among the Republican leadership, is that MAEP needs to be changed to be so that the state can have a more effective formula for providing funding for education in the state. That's, I think, what we learned from the EdBuild formula. I think over time, over the course of the session, presumably, we're going to learn more specific details about how some of their proposals would actually affect individual school districts.
Because that was one of the questions, Brandon, is that we don't have that information yet about the individual districts.
Right, and I think Lucian and I would agree that there still is much to be seen about what this proposal will ultimately be. Obviously, we have a big disagreement over how Republican leadership feels about MAEP and how Democrats feel. We feel that MAEP has never really been given a fair chance to survive, only funded twice since its inception. really never given a chance to do what it was intended to do. But elections have consequences, and it looks like we're going to get something new. Didn't hear the district-by-district data, which you just mentioned. We also didn't have kind of a dollar-for-dollar comparison of what we're spending now to what the price tag might ultimately be. And so, look, Republicans are talking more about education. I think as Democrats, it's incumbent upon us to welcome that, to try to be a part of it to the extent we can be, and wait and see what the ultimate proposal is. I am wondering, though, Wilson, if we'll see that big proposal this year. That'll be interesting.
Yeah, and I don't think that was clear from the hearing as to whether or not we're going to see legislation this year to change the MAEP formula. But I do think, to your point, on the Republican side, there's a view that there is a real need for a change. And so I think if we don't see it this session, we're going to see it next session.
And if we don't see it this session, then what? We continue with MAEP, and then a determination has to be made about how much to fund it?
I think either way, whether we come up with a new formula or whether MAEP stays in place, the legislature is going to have to do what they've done every year for the 20-some-odd years it's been in place, which is look at the pie of available revenues and determine how much is going to go to education. Now, keep in mind, we spend over $2 billion each year out of a $6 billion budget on the MAEP formula. So we're already spending a considerable amount of the state's tax revenues on MAEP. But yeah, at the end of the day, whether there's a new formula or not, the legislature is going to have to look and see what can they do within the revenues that are available to them.
Yeah, we don't want our legislators getting nervous at home. You can always just continue to not fund the current formula. That's an option.
It's worth pointing out, though, that education is getting more funding under the Republican leadership over the course of the last 5 years than it has in the history of the state. So we may not be hitting the formula requirements, but we are increasing the amount of spending each year that goes to public education.
Well, that issue was brought up by Ms. Sibilia, who the CEO of EdBuild, who said that perhaps Mississippi is actually spending too large a chunk of its overall budget on education. Did that surprise you?
I don't know if it surprised me. I've been somewhat critical of EdBuild just based on their general profile. I mean, this is an interesting group that does have sort of a bend to it. I do share Representative Hughes' concerns that money's going to be raised somewhere. And they did kind of raise the specter during the presentation of taxes raising at the local level. And this could be particularly true in some of these cities that are now benefiting from the 27% rule, where they're not having to pay more than that to have their educational programs funded. So there are a lot of details here, but no, that particular part didn't surprise me, but we should all be sensitive to the fact that could mean local taxes.
It also, I think it changes it from a purely partisan analysis in terms of how some change could get through, because EdBuild's suggestions, as I appreciate them, are that local communities ought to contribute more money to education as a percentage, that the state should provide less and the local communities ought to ultimately provide more. Well, that may or may not be good policy, but it's very difficult politics if you've got to go back and say, well, guys, I've got great news. We're going to be more conservative by providing less state funding for education, and then have the supervisors turn around and say, well, congratulations, we're going to raise your property taxes. I don't think that's the intention of the Speaker or the Lieutenant Governor, and I'm sure that they don't want to see any taxes go up. But it does have the potential to get politically dicey over the course of the session.
The partisan fights get tired. We can quit killing each other over being a Democrat or Republican and get back to that age-old game of killing each other from being from the Gulf Coast or from being up north or from being in the Pine Belt. Something we can all get back into.
Let's talk about the State of the State address, what we talked about at the top of this program. Were there any surprises, Brandon, to you that came out of the State of the State address?
For me, yes, and it wasn't what was said, it was what was not said. We've spent some time on this air talking about an infrastructure bill. There's been a lot of talk about it. I think it's been highlighted as a priority for both parties. I think that'd be fair that we had talked about that going into the session. Governor Bryant didn't mention an infrastructure plan. He did not mention a roads and bridges plan, which I think is the clearest indication we've had yet that there will probably not be a bill this year.
I think you saw sort of a different tone from the governor than you've seen in some of his earlier State of the States. I mean, States of the State, he's now in his 6th year as governor. This is his 6th State of the State, his 8th major address as governor, if you include the 2 inaugural addresses. And I think you're starting to see this very natural shift to, rather than proposing entirely new policy ideas, building on those core themes that he came into office on. I mean, he talked about the importance of education. He talked about the achievements that we've made over the course of the last 5 years in employment. Pointed out that we now have unemployment at the lowest level since 2004. And I think that's just a natural progression over the course of the 8 years someone's governor. As you get into the 6th and the 7th and the 8th year, you're continuing to lead and you're continuing to provide new ideas, but you're doing it very much in this context of the themes that brought you into office and that you've worked on since you got there.
Is it also a concession to the fact that perhaps this legislature would not be amenable to a roads and bridges bill that might include a tax increase or some other revenue generating vehicle?
You know, I think it's probably a reflection. I think he's made his views very well known on the transportation issue. I mean, I think he said he would be supportive of, he'd be comfortable with some sort of revenue enhancement if it was offset with some sort of tax decrease, so that the net effect on most Mississippians was not to pay more in taxes. And so, yeah, I mean, I think at this point the ball is very much in the legislature's court to determine what they're willing to pass.
And I guess we should point out, if there is no infrastructure bill passed, that doesn't mean that roads and bridges don't get fixed. It just means that MDOT continues with its current level of funding, correct?
You know, some wouldn't get fixed, but they would continue to get whatever their typical appropriation amount is. I mean, the budgeting process is complex. They would get some allotment. I think what the experts would say is that it wouldn't be enough to replace what needs to be replaced. You wouldn't see any serious, you know, change in asphalt and concrete, and that's a concern.
You mentioned revenue, Lucian. The governor mentioned revenue and tied it to a possible lottery. He acknowledged the fact that the lawmakers provided the path for that years ago, to where it's not prohibited by the Constitution anymore. So did that surprise you when he suggested maybe this is the time to start seriously considering a lottery in Mississippi?
Yeah, I was, you know, he first mentioned the possibility of a lottery back in his executive budget back in November. And so I was surprised when that came out. I was particularly surprised that he doubled down on it last night. Now, he didn't say we need to have a lottery, but he did say, for the first time that I'm aware of, that we need to have a serious discussion about a lottery, and talked about some of the benefits in other states. And to my mind, that's a game changer in the possibility of a lottery getting through the legislature, because here you've got the most popular statewide elected official, both among Democrats and Republicans, a strong following, particularly in among rural and evangelical voters, who are going to tend to be the most opposed to a lottery. And you've got Phil Bryant coming out and saying we ought to at least have a discussion about a lottery. I think that's going to provide a lot of cover to members who might personally think it's a good idea, but be concerned about the politics back home, to at least have a discussion about it like he's asked for.
You know, I've said in the past that Governor Bryant has a type of popularity that enables him to do big things. And this was an unexpected thing, but I think it's a good use of his popularity. He's the type of person that can lead on public policy by virtue of the level of support he has. And even though he and I may disagree, I like it when he kind of swings big, and this is a big swing. And you heard Attorney General Jim Hood say that he thought it was a good idea. I think from Democrats' perspective, what we would say is, let's explore it. Let's see what the potential package is, but let's make sure that we send a lot of that money into the classroom. Let's make sure that it's dedicated to infrastructure, roads and bridges. And so that'll be the next phase of the conversation, I suppose, is where we dedicate some of that money.
And that, I think, is where you can see where there could be another potential hang-up. I mean, you first got to get past whether or not there are enough votes in both chambers to actually authorize a lottery, to get into the business of it. But the governor's executive budget was very clear that he doesn't support a lottery whose revenues are focused exclusively and by law on a single expenditure area. And I think it's relatively clear that the Democratic position is going to be, let's have a lottery and let's dedicate 100% of it, or a significant portion of it, to education. And I think what you'll see from the governor, and I think most Republicans, is we want to have the people's representatives continue to have the freedom to determine where revenue that comes into the state gets spent. And I think that could be a holdup on the whole discussion.
Yeah. Could it be, the lottery that is, a tough sell among legislators from the coast who have, along the river counties, who have the interests of the casinos in mind?
You make a good point. That will be where the considerable pushback comes from. The casino industry in Mississippi will tell you that they have suffered, that Tunica is suffering, that other locations are having some difficulty as we continue to go through an economic downturn here in Mississippi. And so they would be, I think, the first to say that this type of competition is not helpful. And that'll have to be factored in. I mean, that's a very big industry. It's a very big mover down on the Gulf Coast, and a very big industry where it exists elsewhere. So that will be a considerable concern and a part of this whole recipe.
Yeah, it's an important part of Mississippi's economy. But we know from last year that, at least as of last year, there were the votes in the House to authorize a lottery. I mean, there were 2 test votes last year. It wasn't a bill that came out, but just under the House rules, there was a way to force a vote on a lottery, and it passed both times. So, you know, there certainly will be these questions of how we spend the money. There'll be the regional concerns. There'll be the industrial concerns with the gaming industry. But I think as of last year, and there hadn't been much of a change in members, there were the votes to do it. It's sort of a question of whether it'll be given a vote in the House, and what the Senate will do with it if it comes over.
There's a lot of money coming Mississippi's way from the BP oil spill settlement. Will this be a contentious issue about how that money should be spent? The governor indicated in his State of the State that he thinks it should stay on the coast primarily because that's where most of the damage was and the suffering.
Yeah, the money that's coming in is designed to make the state whole for what the state lost as a result of the BP oil spill in terms of tax money. And what I thought was most interesting in the State of the State, when the governor said we need to put this aside in a separate fund, it needs to be spent on the Gulf Coast, you saw both Republicans and Democrats from the coast stand up and applaud, but you saw both Republicans and Democrats from the rest of the state sit in their seats. So, I mean, I think this is going to be a bipartisan fight that's primarily regional, where I think you have folks in the northern part of the state who are going to say, this was money to make the state whole. It would have been spent in the northern part of the state when the spill happened. And folks from the coast who understandably say we were the ones who were directly affected. It's money from the spill. It needs to be spent down here.
He articulated it very well. I think the governor really said it quite well and you're going to see good bipartisan support. I think Lucian's right. It's going to be a little bit of regionalism that may, rear its head on this one. But I think the governor's outlined a plan that makes good sense. And of course, now look, on the Gulf Coast, another piece of this is we all remember how some Hurricane Katrina money was used to plug the budget. And that left a lot of us chafe down there because we thought, this was intended for rebuilding of a particular region. So you will see some interest from the Gulf Coast in making sure that whatever account we set up has some strong earmarks or some strong language, making sure it remains dedicated if that's its purpose.
And it's coming in at a particularly, if your view is that the money needs to be spent exclusively on the coast, it's coming in at a particularly precarious time because we've seen multiple rounds of revenue, budget cuts this year. Revenue, even though revenue's up, it's not hitting projections. So there's certainly going to be a temptation to some folks to say, well, let's take this economic damages money, toss it in the budget, and then we don't have to worry about cutting services.
Yeah. The peaceful transfer of power has happened in Washington. We have a new president, a Republican president, Donald Trump. Brandon, what does that mean for Mississippi? We talked about what it could mean some time ago when it was clear that he was a major contender. What happens now that it's a reality?
We're reminded during these moments of that great letter that George Bush wrote to Bill Clinton that said, "Your victories are our victories." And I think that our sense of patriotism, our sense of dedication to country should always overwhelm whatever partisan feelings we have. And so as a Democrat, I want this president to be successful. I want our government to be successful. And I hope that it means, and look, we don't succeed in part. In the same way that only Republicans don't stand to lose or win by virtue of what this president does, individual states don't stand to do. We all do better either together or we don't do better. And so I think to the extent that he institutes good plans, I think to the extent that he casts some vision that could be helpful, whether it's in infrastructure or other things, I'm pulling for him, and I'm pulling for this country. Obviously, I'm somewhat skeptical, but this is his first day in office. Let's give him his day. I have been very disappointed in the way that Republicans have continued to litigate and relitigate the election of Barack Obama. I am holding myself to the standard of not doing that. So it's his first day. Let's be hopeful.
Yeah, I don't think Brandon could have said it any better. I mean, I agree completely. There's something beautiful, I think, about whether or not you're excited about the person who's being sworn in as president, watching the actual moment when we have a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, the outgoing president who clearly was not supportive of President Trump and President Obama was there on stage. Hillary Clinton, who worked very hard to make sure he wasn't president, was there on stage because at the end of the day, you do want the president to be successful, and it's a powerful symbol that the people have spoken. Whether or not that's the person you thought should have won, that's the person that the people ultimately decided should have won through the electoral system.
Yeah. And of course, Donald Trump easily carried Mississippi. But the uncertainty about the national economy and how a new president might steer it, how does that affect decisions that lawmakers in Jackson make?
I mean, I think there's certainly going to be questions about what could possibly happen in Medicaid. And what sort of funding changes might come as the ACA, as Obamacare gets repealed or rolled back. I do think it's an opportunity for Mississippi. I mean, back when Governor Barber was here, he had a good relationship with George W. Bush. I would argue that Governor Bryant has a much closer relationship with President Trump, and that can ultimately be a tremendous asset to us, to have a governor who's able to get the president and his senior staff on the phone when the state needs something. I think it benefited us immensely during Hurricane Katrina, and I certainly hope it won't be because of a disaster, but I think as the state needs things, having a governor who's able to get the president on the phone is a tremendous opportunity for us.
I think it's an unfortunate reality that we do allow partisanship to affect how we accept or deny federal programs, but it is a reality. I mean, and it's not just a Mississippi-specific thing, although Mississippi has been quite loud about refusing federal help when it comes from a President Obama administration as opposed to a President Bush administration. It's short-sighted, it's foolish, but it's a reality. And so with an overwhelmingly Republican legislature, I think that they might be open to Medicaid expansion of a kind that comes in a form from a Republican government. They would be open to state funding for roads and bridges if it came from a Republican White House. It's kind of silly, and that's a hard thing to explain to folks that are watching it from home. But I can't say that Democrats are different. I mean, you might see California decide to kind of go on their own on some things. So I don't want to pretend that this is a one-sided thing.
And I think part of the reason that they're more likely to be accepting of federal money, the Republicans would, is because we have more trust that it won't come with strings we can't accept.
We'll let that be the last word. Lucian, thank you for sitting in with us tonight. We thank you for joining us. We're out of time. We'll be back next week with another edition of At Issue.